The spotlight has faded, leaving behind an eerie silence. In the backstage shadows, where mirrors no longer reflect light, a heavy sigh echoes through the crowd. Eyes fall on the empty chair where she once sat, a chair that had witnessed thunderous applause, now replaced by an unsettling stillness. She's gone, with no farewell, only murmurs and questions that remain unanswered. Years ago, she was a symbol of brilliance. Her name, powerful and resonant, etched itself into the hearts of millions. Every stage, every gaze, every heartbeat aligned with that name. But now, there's nothing left but the haunting presence of a ghost, memories intertwined with applause that fades into nothingness. At the height of her career, she stood at the pinnacle of success, where anything could be bought with fame. Songs, performances, and moments that made the audience tremble in exhilaration. But what made her leave all that behind? What made her step away from everything that anyone would die to achieve? What made her retreat into the shadows when the world was at her feet? The lights are gone. Only the silence remains in a life that no one could have predicted. And the questions begin to emerge. Did she find the peace she was desperately seeking? Or was she simply worn out, drained by the cost of her fame? The stories of her rise were legendary. She wasn't just a star, she was an icon. Everyone saw the brilliance, the seamless performances, the adoration of millions, the way the world spun on her axis. Her name sparkled on every marquee, lighting up stages from one corner of the globe to the other. There was no denying it. She was everything the industry promised it could make of someone, and more. But that radiant light hid a darker shadow, one that few were willing to acknowledge, let alone speak of. Behind the applause, beneath the accolades, there was something else. A growing discomfort, an undercurrent of tension that no one was willing to confront. The adoration of the public had its price. She began to feel it, a creeping doubt that wrapped itself around her heart like a suffocating weight. The industry, with all its glitz and glamour, wasn't built on loyalty. It was built on illusion. And she, the shining jewel at its center, could feel the edges of that illusion start to crack. She had been given everything: fame, fortune, the adulation of millions. But what was it really worth if the price was her sense of self? What was it worth if, in the end, she was left alone to navigate a world where everyone wanted a piece of her, but no one really cared about her as a person? As she stood there, at the height of her career, she realized the pedestal she had been placed on had started to feel less like an honor and more like a trap. There were whispers, subtle, almost imperceptible at first. The casual comments about her vocal style, her performance choices, the way she carried herself in public. People began to question not just her art, but her very essence. Was she a product of her own talent, or was she a vessel for a machine that chewed her up and spat her out when it was done? The rumors escalated, the criticisms grew louder, and the adoration, once so intoxicating, began to taste like ash. She had long been a part of the elite. But the closer she got to the top, the more it became clear that she wasn't part of the family they had promised her. The industry that had made her a star had also made her a prisoner of its own making. The public adored her, but the whispers behind closed doors told a different story. It was the story of competition, of envy, of an industry that devoured its own to feed its hunger for the next big thing. And she was a casualty of it all. But the real toll wasn't just the public's shifting opinion. It was the personal cost, the erosion of friendships, the dismantling of relationships that once held deep meaning. The more famous she became, the more she had to give up, until there was almost nothing left. The loyalty she had expected from her peers was replaced by cold, calculated distance. Those who had once been her closest allies were now the ones throwing stones from behind their own glass walls. Her music, once filled with raw emotion and truth, began to feel like a distant echo of the person she had once been. She had poured herself into every note, every lyric, every performance. But now, it seemed as though the more she gave, the less of herself she had to offer. The sparkle in her eyes, the fire in her voice, was being dulled by the demands of the industry, the loneliness of the road, the absence of any true connection. And so, she continued, trapped in a world where love and adoration felt like a performance in itself. A mask, one that hid her true self behind layers of expectation and perfection. But the truth was, the adulation that once filled her with pride now weighed heavy on her soul. The legacy she had built, the name she had made for herself, had started to feel like a curse. Every day she walked the tightrope of fame. Every night she stepped onto a stage to perform, she felt the pull of the abyss waiting just behind the spotlight. The more the public loved her, the more she felt herself slipping away. In the end, the question was no longer whether the world would remember her, but whether she could remember herself amidst the chaos of it all. Her name was synonymous with success, but what had success truly given her? What had it taken away? And as the years went by, the very thing that had elevated her to stardom seemed to be the thing that kept her prisoner. Every time the crowd cheered, every time the lights blazed down upon her, she couldn't help but wonder, had she ever truly been free? The more she fought against the tide of public opinion, the more it felt like she was fighting against herself. And the more she succeeded, the more isolated she became. The applause of the audience became the only thing she could hear, drowning out the whispers of the soul that begged for peace, for authenticity, for a return to the person she had once been before fame had taken hold of her. And yet, she pressed on, not because she had found any joy in it, but because she didn't know how to stop. She had built her empire on the stage, and to walk away now would mean destroying everything she had worked for. So she continued to sing, continued to perform, continued to live a life that had become a mask of itself. And in that performance, she found only the faintest echo of who she used to be. As the years passed, the public's love remained, but it became harder to distinguish between love and ownership. Had she truly been loved for herself, or was she simply a creation of their desires, their expectations? And as she stood before the world, bathed in the spotlight, she couldn't help but wonder if anyone had ever truly known the real her. The fame that had once been a dream had now become a suffocating reality, and the legacy she had built felt more like a weight than a triumph. But she couldn't turn back. The industry had made sure of that. She was their creation, and they would not let her go so easily. It was supposed to be just another day in the long, grinding cycle of fame. Another show, another audience, another night where she would stand beneath the blinding lights and give her all. But this time, something was different. The air was thick with a tension that no one had anticipated, least of all her. The very thing that had always felt like a sanctuary. The stage, the audience, the music was suddenly transformed into a battlefield. And at the center of it all, she felt an intense, overwhelming sense of fear. The first warning signs were subtle. A shift in the way people were looking at her, a tone in their voices that hadn't been there before. At first, it was nothing she couldn't ignore. After all, she was used to the judgments, the whispers, the expectations that came with being who she was. She had learned to tune them out, focusing instead on the one thing that still kept her grounded, the music. But that night, everything changed. It began innocuously enough. She stepped on stage, her usual confidence intact. The crowd roared with applause, just as they always did. But there was something different in the air, something that made her pulse quicken, that made her stomach churn. It wasn't the performance, it wasn't the music, it was the people around her. Their faces, their eyes, their smiles, they seemed somehow distant, almost indifferent. As the night wore on, she could feel the creeping weight of something terrible hanging over her. She could see the smallest movements in the corners of her vision. A glance exchanged between the band members, a whispered word from a crew member, a sudden tightening of her manager's jaw. It was as though everyone around her was caught in some invisible web, struggling to break free from the tension that was slowly building. And in the center of it all stood her, alone, exposed, caught in the relentless glare of the lights. By the time the final song came around, she knew something was wrong. The energy of the crowd, which usually lifted her up, felt like a crushing force pressing down on her. She began to sing, her voice trembling slightly at first. She could feel the cracks starting to show, the first signs of the unraveling. But she pushed through, just as she had always done. After all, what was she if not the embodiment of strength, of unbreakable resolve? But then, something happened that shook her to the core. In the middle of her performance, a light flickered out, just a brief moment of darkness, but enough to disrupt the rhythm. The band faltered for just a second, and in that second, it was as if the entire world around her had come crashing down. She could feel her breath catch in her throat, a sudden tightness seizing her chest. It wasn't just the technical issue, it was something deeper, a warning from within herself that everything she had worked for, everything she had built, was about to come crashing down. The song continued, but the magic was gone. The notes no longer felt like they belonged to her. They felt foreign, alien. The crowd's enthusiasm had faded into a hum of confusion, as if they, too, could sense the shift. The energy that had once been her lifeblood was now draining from her, and she was powerless to stop it. As the final note rang out, she felt the cold, suffocating weight of a realization settle upon her. The very thing that had brought her here, the music, the fame, the adoration, was now the thing that was tearing her apart. The cracks in her world had widened, and there was no escaping them. Backstage, everything fell silent. The applause from the audience seemed distant, muffled, as if it were happening in another world. She walked off the stage, her steps slow, deliberate, each one heavier than the last. The adrenaline that had fueled her for so many years now felt like a distant memory, replaced by a gnawing emptiness that she couldn't shake. The worst part wasn't the show itself, it was the moments that followed. The hollow glances exchanged behind the curtains, the strained smiles from the crew members, the uncomfortable silence from her closest allies. It was as though they had all known something she didn't, something she was too afraid to face. They all knew, but no one was willing to speak the truth aloud. It was that night, in the solitude of her dressing room, that she first realized the full extent of what had been happening to her. The music, which had once been her refuge, her salvation, had become a prison. The adoration, the applause, the fame, it had all turned against her. What had once felt like a dream had become a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The next few days were a blur. She canceled interviews, shut herself off from the world, and tried to make sense of the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She wasn't just struggling with the pressures of fame. She was struggling with herself. She had given everything to the world, but in return, she had lost herself in the process. The woman who had once stood proud on stage, confident and unyielding, was now a shadow of the person she used to be. The worst part was the guilt of knowing that she had sacrificed everything, her peace, her happiness, her identity, just to maintain the image that the world had expected of her. The guilt of not being able to escape the life she had built, even though it no longer felt like her own. But the breaking point had come. The moment she had tried so desperately to avoid had finally arrived. The walls that she had so carefully constructed around herself had crumbled, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, and afraid. It wasn't just the breakdown of her career. It was the breakdown of her entire identity. The realization that she had spent so long trying to be someone else, someone the world wanted her to be, that she had lost touch with the woman she had once been. And now, in the quiet aftermath, she could only wonder, could she ever get it back? Would she ever find herself again, or had she already lost her forever? In the end, the thing that had brought her to the top, the music, the fame, the adoration, had become the very thing that had destroyed her. The stage that had once felt like home now felt like a cage, one from which there was no escape. And as the lights faded, she was left to face the one question that had always haunted her. Was it all worth it? She sat in silence, the weight of the years pressing down on her chest, and for the first time in a long time, the chaos of the world outside felt distant. There was no applause, no screaming fans, no flashing lights. There was only the room, the empty chair across from her, and the quiet hum of her own thoughts. It was in these moments, far removed from the stage, that the pieces of her identity began to fall into place. Not the glittering image the world had crafted for her, but the person she had been before all the fame, before the spotlight. She closed her eyes, and for a brief second, she was no longer the famous singer everyone knew. She was a little girl again, standing in the dust of her hometown, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Her mother's voice would float through the air, singing songs that echoed through the walls of their modest home. Her father, a man whose hands were calloused from years of hard work, would hum along, his deep baritone filling the spaces between them. It was simple, it was pure, and it was real. Those were the days before the industry had its hands on her, before the world had tried to mold her into something she wasn't. Back then, music was a refuge. It wasn't a product. It wasn't an expectation. It wasn't a tool for survival. It was just a way to feel alive, to breathe, to connect with the rhythm of life, without judgment, without compromise. The memory of those days, of her family and their humble existence, brought with it a bittersweet ache. How had she allowed herself to lose touch with that part of herself? How had she allowed the world to strip away the very thing that had once made her whole? In the beginning, it had been easy to forget. She had been young, naive, and full of dreams. The glitz and glamour of the industry had been intoxicating. It had promised her everything: success, recognition, a life beyond her wildest imaginings. And she had grasped it all with open arms. She had sung for the crowds, poured her heart into every note, and given herself to the world, hoping that by doing so, she would find the validation she so desperately craved. But as the years wore on, as the lights dimmed and the applause grew fainter, she began to realize the truth. The fame, the recognition, it had all come at a cost. A price she had not fully understood until it was too late. She had traded her authenticity for acceptance. She had silenced her true voice in favor of the one that the world wanted to hear. And in doing so, she had lost herself. Now, as she sat there in the silence, she found herself yearning for the days when music had been just music, when it was a conversation with her soul. She remembered how it felt to sing without the weight of expectation pressing down on her. To sing because it was an expression of who she was, not because it was a demand of the industry. The way her mother's songs had been simple, direct, and true to their essence. They weren't about pleasing anyone else. They were about communicating something deep and personal, something that resonated in the quiet spaces between the notes. But as the years had passed, she had allowed the noise of the world to drown out that inner voice. She had become so caught up in the need for approval, the thirst for fame, that she had lost sight of what had first drawn her to music. And now, sitting alone in her room, she couldn't help but feel the sting of regret. She had let herself be consumed by something that had never truly mattered. She had let herself become something she wasn't, in order to fit a mold that wasn't hers to begin with. As she sat there, her thoughts drifted to her family, to the values they had instilled in her. They had taught her to be honest, to be true to herself, and to never compromise who she was for the sake of others. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten those lessons. She had allowed the pressures of the industry, the expectations of fame, to steer her off course. And in doing so, she had lost touch with the very thing that had once grounded her, her own truth. She thought back to the times when she had walked through the streets of her small town, her head held high, her heart filled with the simple joy of being herself. There had been no need for validation then. There had been no need for anyone else to tell her who she was. She had known. She had felt it in every step, in every breath. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten that feeling. She had traded it for something she thought would make her happier, something she thought would fill the emptiness. But it hadn't. The emptiness remained, lurking in the corners of her soul, a reminder of what she had lost. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about herself. The girl who had once danced in the fields, her laughter ringing out like a song in the wind, had disappeared. And in her place stood a woman who had given everything to the world, but had received little in return, except for a life that no longer felt like hers. She let out a long, shaky breath, her fingers trembling slightly as they rested on the piano keys in front of her. It was time, she realized. Time to rediscover herself. Time to return to the roots that had once given her strength, to the music that had once been her sanctuary. She didn't know how it would happen or what the journey would look like. But one thing was certain. She was no longer willing to sacrifice her truth for the world's approval. It was time to find her voice again. And this time, it would be hers. No masks, no compromises, just the music and the truth that it carried. The woman who stood on stage for the world's applause was gone. The woman who stood here now, quiet, uncertain, but ready, was the one who would find herself once more. And in doing so, she would reclaim the very thing that had always been hers, her soul. In the years that followed, the consequences of her choices began to unfold slowly but inexorably. The music had once been her salvation, but now it felt like a bitter reminder of everything she had lost. She could no longer escape the reality that her life had become a series of compromises, each one leading her further from the person she had once been. The life she had built, the world she had carefully constructed, now seemed like a fragile house of cards, ready to collapse with the slightest breath. The first sign of the erosion was the relationships. The friendships that had once felt so genuine now felt like obligations. The people around her, those who had once been her closest allies, seemed more like actors playing their parts in the performance of her life. She had given so much of herself to the industry, to the public, to the fans, that she had forgotten to give to those who had once mattered most. And now, those connections felt distant, strained, like a faint echo of what they had been. Her family, too, felt the toll. She had spent so much of her life chasing after success that she had neglected the people who had always been there for her. Her parents, her siblings, those who had known her before the lights and the fame. They were the ones who had always loved her for who she was, not for what she could give them. But even they had started to fade into the background, lost in the whirlwind of her career. And then there was her own reflection. The woman she saw in the mirror no longer looked like the person she remembered. The years had taken their toll, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The exhaustion from constant touring, the pressure of maintaining an image, the toll of living a life that wasn't her own, it had all caught up to her. Her once radiant smile now seemed forced, her eyes dull with the weight of unspoken regrets. She had spent so much time trying to be someone else, trying to live up to the expectations of others, that she had forgotten what it meant to truly live for herself. But perhaps the most painful consequence was the erosion of her joy. Music, which had once been a source of pure expression, had become a business, a product to be sold. What had once been an outlet for her deepest emotions had now become a routine, a formula that had to be repeated night after night, performance after performance. She had given so much of herself to the stage that there was little left for anything else. The music, the applause, the fame, they had all started to feel hollow, like empty vessels that could never truly fulfill her. The toll on her mental health had been more gradual, more insidious. She had always prided herself on her resilience, on her ability to push through the toughest times. But now, the cracks in her armor were becoming impossible to ignore. The anxiety, the self-doubt, the overwhelming sense of isolation, they were all becoming part of her reality. She had spent so long pretending to be invincible that she had failed to acknowledge the toll it was taking on her mind and body. Now, the weight of it all was crushing her. There were moments, quiet moments, when she was alone, when the floodgates opened and she couldn't hold back the tears anymore. She would sit in her room, her hands trembling, and wonder where it had all gone wrong. How had she lost herself in this whirlwind of fame and success? How had she let the world take so much from her? The music, the adoration, it had all seemed so worth it at the time. But now, in the silence, it felt like the cost had been far too high. Her health had also begun to deteriorate. The sleepless nights, the long hours on the road, the endless performances, they had taken their toll on her body. The constant pressure to look perfect, to sound perfect, to be perfect, it was a weight that no one could carry forever. She had always ignored the warning signs, always brushed aside the aches and pains, convincing herself that she could push through. But now, her body was rebelling. She couldn't ignore it anymore. And the hardest part, perhaps, was the realization that all of this, the fame, the music, the adoration, had come at the expense of her own happiness. She had spent so much time trying to please everyone else, trying to live up to their expectations, that she had lost sight of what truly mattered. She had forgotten how to just be happy, how to find joy in the simple things. The moments of peace, of quiet, of just being present. Those were the things she had taken for granted. And now, they seemed like distant dreams, just out of reach. As the years passed, the weight of these consequences began to feel unbearable. She had built a career, a legacy, but at what cost? She had become a symbol of success, but at the expense of her own soul. The world had loved her, yes, but it had also demanded so much in return. And now, as she stood on the edge of it all, she couldn't help but wonder if it had all been worth it. The damage wasn't something that could be undone. The relationships couldn't be repaired overnight. The years of sacrifice, of giving herself to others at the expense of her own well-being, had left permanent scars. And yet, she couldn't help but wonder if there was still time to heal. Could she ever reclaim the life she had lost? Could she ever find a way to rebuild, to start over? The answer, she realized, wasn't simple. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a single decision or a moment of clarity. It would take time to heal, time to rebuild, time to find herself again. But one thing was clear, she couldn't go on like this forever. Something had to change. The consequences of the past had already shaped her future, but it was still up to her to decide what that future would look like. In the quiet moments, she began to understand that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, to accept it, and to move forward. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. It never was. But it was the only road left for her to take. And so, with a heavy heart and a weary soul, she began the long process of finding herself again, one step at a time. There comes a point in every person's life when the truth is no longer something they can run from. It has a way of cornering you, slipping into your thoughts when you're least prepared for it, and exposing everything you have tried to hide. For her, that moment arrived unexpectedly, as most defining moments do. It wasn't a loud, explosive realization, but a quiet one that forced her to confront herself, to face the ugly truth that had been lurking in the shadows for years. It wasn't that she didn't know it was coming. In some way, she had always known that this reckoning would arrive. The pressure of living a life dictated by others, by the world's expectations, had been building for years. She had buried the doubts, the fears, the guilt beneath layers of performance and smiles, telling herself that she could keep going, that she could push through anything. But now, there was no denying it. The cracks had finally shattered open, and she could no longer pretend that everything was okay. It began with a phone call, a simple request for a performance. She had been asked to sing at an event, a gala of some sort. The kind of event that had once excited her, the kind of occasion where she could bask in the spotlight, receive the applause, and feel the adoration of the crowd. But this time it was different. The invitation felt like a heavy burden, a reminder of all the things she had pushed aside. The voice on the other end of the phone was kind, respectful, but there was an edge to it that she couldn't ignore. She had heard it before, the desperation, the expectation. It was in that moment, as she sat in her quiet living room, the phone pressed against her ear, that she realized she couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't keep pretending. She couldn't keep playing the role that the world wanted her to play. The idea of performing, of stepping back into that world of artificiality and expectation, felt suffocating. It wasn't just the music, it was the life that came with it. The constant traveling, the endless performances, the smiling faces that would disappear the moment the curtains fell. She hung up the phone and stared at the wall, her chest tight with the weight of her decision. It wasn't just the performance she was rejecting. It was everything, the life she had been living, the person she had become. For so long, she had allowed herself to be consumed by the need for approval, for validation. But now, she was faced with the undeniable truth. She had lost herself in the process. And more than that, she had allowed the world to take pieces of her, one performance at a time. The truth had come crashing down on her like a wave, and in that moment, she understood that there was no turning back. She couldn't keep hiding from the reality of her own unhappiness, her own self-doubt. She had spent years chasing after something she thought would fulfill her, but now she saw it for what it truly was, a fleeting, empty pursuit. The lights, the crowds, the applause. It had all become a blur of noise, a constant distraction from the deeper truth she had been avoiding. She was no longer living for herself. She was living for the world's approval, and that would never be enough. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be no sudden revelation, no instant cure for the years of self-imposed denial. But in that moment, she understood that the first step toward healing was acknowledging the truth, no matter how painful. The truth that she had allowed herself to be shaped by the expectations of others, that she had built a life around the opinions of people she didn't even know, and that she had sacrificed her own happiness in the process. But it wasn't just about regret. It wasn't about wishing things had been different. It was about the realization that she still had the power to change. She didn't have to keep playing the role that had been assigned to her. She didn't have to keep living the life that had been written for her by others. She had the ability, for the first time in years, to step out of the shadow of her past and decide who she wanted to be. It wasn't going to be easy. The world wouldn't just let her walk away from the persona she had created. The expectations would still be there, lurking in the background, waiting for her to fall back into line. But she was tired of living that way, tired of being someone she wasn't, tired of pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. The truth was, she had never been more exhausted in her life, and she couldn't keep going like this anymore. The phone call had been the catalyst, the moment that forced her to confront the life she had built and the person she had become. But it was just the beginning. She knew that she had a long road ahead of her, one that would require strength, courage, and, above all, honesty. She had spent so many years running from the truth, and now she had to face it head-on. There would be no grand gesture, no dramatic moment of transformation. It would be a slow process, a series of small steps toward reclaiming her life, her identity, and her happiness. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something that had been missing for years. Hope. Hope that she could rebuild. Hope that she could rediscover the woman she had once been, before the world had molded her into something she was never meant to be. The moment had come. The truth had been revealed, and there was no turning back. But she was ready, ready to embrace the future, ready to face the consequences of the past, and most of all, ready to start living for herself once again. It was a quiet moment, one that she never expected to come. For years, she had carried the weight of her silence, her unresolved feelings, and the things she had never said. But now, in the aftermath of everything, she found herself at a crossroads where words could no longer be avoided. It wasn't about seeking forgiveness. It wasn't about asking for anything. It was simply about the truth, the kind of truth that had been buried under layers of pride, fear, and self-imposed exile. She sat in the dim light of her living room, the faint glow of the city's lights creeping through the window. The night was quiet, and for once, her mind wasn't racing. The memories, the struggles, the emotions, they had all led her here. She had spent so long hiding from the truth, from the things that weighed heavily on her heart, that she hadn't realized how much of herself she had lost along the way. The truth was simple, but it had taken years to fully understand. The person she had been, the woman who had once stood tall and confident on stage, had been shaped by the expectations of others. She had given herself over to the world, to the applause, to the validation, and in doing so had lost sight of who she really was. She had spent so much time trying to fit into the mold others had created for her that she forgot to ask herself what she truly wanted, what she truly needed. Now, at this moment, she was no longer that woman. She was no longer the person who had lived for the approval of the world. She had learned too much over the years to remain in that place. The lessons were hard-won, but they had brought her to a place where she could finally see clearly, where she could finally understand the things she had been running from. The process of change, of transformation, was not easy, and it certainly wasn't quick. But it was happening. Slowly, steadily, it was happening. And then came the question that had haunted her for so long. Why now? Why had she waited so long to say the things that had been weighing on her for years? It wasn't about regret. It wasn't about fixing everything that had gone wrong in her life. She knew that some things could never be undone. There was no going back to the way things were. But there was still the possibility of moving forward, of finding a way to heal, to make peace with the choices she had made and the person she had become. And in order to do that, she had to speak the words that had been locked away for so long. The hardest part was acknowledging the truth in its rawest form. The truth that the world had never truly known her. The truth that she had allowed herself to be shaped by everything and everyone around her, instead of living authentically. She had always been so focused on pleasing others, on meeting their expectations, that she had forgotten the most important thing: pleasing herself, loving herself, being true to herself. And so, in the stillness of that night, she began to speak. The words didn't come easily at first. They were tangled, hesitant, like they had been waiting for so long to be set free. But once they started, they came tumbling out, one after another, until there was nothing left to say but the simple truth. The things she had kept buried deep inside her, the emotions she had buried under layers of success and fame, were finally being released. And with every word, every admission, every confession, she felt a small weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. There was no sudden epiphany. But there was something more profound, something more subtle, the realization that she was finally free. She wasn't looking for redemption. She wasn't trying to fix the past. She wasn't expecting anything from anyone. She had spent so many years waiting for others to understand her, to accept her, to love her. But now, she understood that the only person whose approval she needed was her own. She had spent so much time apologizing for who she was, for what she had become, that she had forgotten the most important thing. She had the right to be who she was unapologetically. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm has passed, the kind of silence that fills the room with a sense of calm. She had said what needed to be said. She had finally acknowledged the truth, and in doing so, she had taken the first step toward healing. It wasn't about fixing everything, about making everything right. It was about accepting that some things can never be undone, and that's okay. Life isn't about perfection. It's about growth, learning, and accepting who we are, flaws and all. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know where her journey would take her from here. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. She had finally let go of the need to be someone else. She had finally let go of the need to please everyone but herself. And in that moment, she realized that the most important thing she could do was live the rest of her life authentically, without fear, without shame, and without the need to seek approval from anyone but herself. The words she had spoken, though late, were not a sign of weakness. They were a declaration of strength. Because sometimes the hardest thing to do is to admit the truth to yourself, and in doing so, to reclaim your life. For the first time in years, she smiled. It wasn't a perfect smile, but it was real. And for her, that was enough. The truth, like a slow-burning fire, had finally made its way into the light. It had taken years, decades, even for the wall she had so carefully built around herself to crumble. In the quiet aftermath of her revelations, there was no grand resolution, no sweeping conclusions to mark the end of the story. There was only the gentle hum of life continuing, but now with the understanding that it would be different from before. Perhaps it would never be the same again, but maybe in some way, that was exactly what she needed. What she had learned through all the pain, the isolation, the betrayals, and the triumphs was that life wasn't about finding the perfect answer or achieving some unreachable standard of success. It wasn't about pleasing others or living for applause. It was about accepting yourself, flaws and all, and learning to live with what you can't change. It was about finding peace in the knowledge that the truth, even when painful, was the only thing that would set her free. She had spent so many years searching for meaning, for validation, for approval, whether it was from the people around her or from the world at large. But now, she understood that the most important person to please was herself. The need for external validation had faded. What mattered now was the quiet acceptance of who she had become, and the courage to continue forward, no longer burdened by the ghosts of her past. But even in this newfound clarity, one question lingered, an echo that refused to fade, no matter how hard she tried to silence it. What now? What would she do with the rest of her life? How could she rebuild the pieces of her existence that had been shattered by the very thing that once made her who she was? The world had seen her as a star, a symbol of success, but now she was left with the daunting task of discovering who she really was when the spotlight was no longer there to define her. What purpose did she serve now that she had removed the mask she had worn for so long? The answer, of course, was not clear. It never is. But there was a quiet understanding that it didn't have to be. She had spent so many years trying to control every aspect of her life, of her image, of the story others had written for her. Now, in this moment of quiet reflection, she realized that the only story worth telling was her own. And for the first time in years, she felt the freedom to write it however she wished. She didn't need a grand plan. She didn't need to fix everything that had gone wrong. What mattered now was the simple act of living authentically, of continuing to create and express, but this time with no expectations from anyone but herself. The stage, the fans, the industry, it no longer held the same weight. What mattered was how she felt in the quiet moments, when the music was turned off, when the lights were dimmed, and when no one was watching. In the years to come, there would be ups and downs, victories and defeats, joys and sorrows. But she now understood that all of it was part of the journey. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson she could have learned. Life was never meant to be perfect, and that was okay. What mattered was the willingness to keep moving forward, to keep creating, and most importantly, to keep being true to herself, no matter what the world demanded. As the days passed, and the echoes of her past slowly faded into the distance, she felt the weight of the years lift from her shoulders. There was no need to rush, no need to hurry. The path ahead would reveal itself in time. But for now, there was peace in the quiet. There was peace in knowing that she had finally freed herself from the burdens of the past, and in doing so, had given herself the chance to start new. And as she looked out at the world, she realized that the question she had carried for so long, the question that had haunted her for years, was now open-ended. There was no final answer, no neat conclusion. It was simply a question that would follow her for as long as she lived. What now? And perhaps that was the beauty of it. Because sometimes the most important question isn't the one with a definitive answer. It's the one that keeps you moving forward, keeps you searching, keeps you growing. And for the first time in a long time, she was ready to answer it, not with words, but with action. As the last vestiges of doubt faded away, she knew this. The rest of her life would be hers to define, not the world's, not the industry's. And that, in itself, was a victory.